In the spring of 1863, Kentucky existed in a state of quiet fracture. Though officially aligned with the Union, the state was riddled with divided loyalties, shifting militias, and rural regions where authority was more custom than law. County records from that year describe long stretches of countryside operating almost independently, governed by reputation and necessity rather than oversight. It was in one such region, along the wooded edges of central Kentucky, that the name Elias Whitcomb first appeared in writing. Whitcomb was listed in agricultural rolls as a falconer, a designation uncommon even then. His property sat just beyond a limestone ridge bordering fields that gave way quickly to dense woodland. Neighbors described him as reserved, meticulous, and deeply attentive to his birds. He was not a hunter in the traditional sense. He did not trap, he trained. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Falconry itself was not unknown, but it was rare enough in Kentucky to draw curiosity. Whitcomb was said to have learned the practice years earlier while traveling east, possibly through contacts formed during the early years of the war. Later testimony would place his return to Kentucky around the same period when the state's internal tensions intensified, as detailed in accounts of Kentucky's divided role during the Civil War. At the time, this coincidence went unnoticed. Those who encountered Whitcomb remarked on the discipline of his birds. Hawks and falcons were kept hooded, silent, and responsive to subtle signals. A neighbor later recalled, "They didn't act wild, they waited." Such observations were offered without suspicion. At first, the earliest incident did not involve injury. A farmhand reported being struck by a bird while crossing a field near Whitcomb's land. The bird withdrew immediately, circling once before returning toward the ridge. The man described the event as startling but controlled, noting that the bird had not clawed blindly. It had approached, made contact, and disengaged. Similar accounts followed over the next weeks. Livestock startled without cause. Children chased briefly by circling shadows. No blood, no lasting harm, just presence. County affidavits from the period show complaints filed, then withdrawn. Whitcomb's name appears several times, always accompanied by qualifiers: alleged, rumored, uncertain. Local authorities hesitated to act. Kentucky's attention was fixed elsewhere, on supply routes, troop movements, and maintaining order amid divided sympathies. A falconer on the edge of a rural county did not warrant immediate concern. Still, notes began to accumulate. One clerk recorded an unusual line after interviewing a witness: "Bird did not behave as animal but as if guided." The phrase was underlined twice, then left unexplained. By midsummer, whispers replaced reports. People spoke of birds that followed rather than fled, that responded to gestures unseen, that appeared where they should not. No one accused Whitcomb directly. The word most often used was trained. And in a state already uneasy from war and mistrust, that word carried more weight than anyone was prepared to admit. By early summer, the county's informal tolerance gave way to unease. Kentucky's civil authorities were already stretched thin, and any disruption that suggested intent, rather than accident, invited scrutiny. The complaints surrounding Whitcomb's birds began to show a pattern that clerks could no longer dismiss as coincidence. A journal kept by a local schoolteacher mentions a morning when classes were dismissed early after several birds began circling the yard. The children were not harmed, but the teacher noted that the birds did not scatter when shouted at. Instead, they drifted higher, holding position until the yard emptied, then departed together toward the same wooded ridge. The entry ends with a question mark in the margin. Farmers near the ridge adjusted their routines. Fields closest to Whitcomb's land were worked in groups rather than alone. Some avoided the area entirely during certain hours. These choices were never framed as fear. They were framed as caution, the same way one avoids a flooded creek without naming it dangerous. County affidavits from June describe 3 separate encounters in which individuals felt guided away from specific paths by circling birds. None reported direct attack. The language was careful, restrained. One witness stated, "They did not strike until I stepped forward again." Another said the birds appeared to respond to a whistle carried on the wind, though no sound was later confirmed. When questioned, Whitcomb denied wrongdoing. His written response, preserved in a later transcription, emphasized discipline and control. He stated that his birds were trained for recall and display, not aggression. He acknowledged that they might appear intimidating to the unaccustomed eye, but insisted he never directed them toward people. His tone was formal, almost instructional. A constable visited the property in mid-June. His report describes an orderly compound. Mews kept clean, birds tethered and hooded, training equipment neatly arranged. Nothing suggested negligence. Yet the constable noted an unusual number of signaling tools, whistles of varying pitch, colored cloths, and weighted lures marked with symbols rather than names. The items were legal. Their purpose was not questioned at the time. References to Kentucky's wartime conditions appeared again in internal correspondence. Officials acknowledged that rural unrest often manifested in rumor, especially during a period when loyalties were uncertain and communities wary. The Falconers case was classified as a potential disturbance rather than a crime. Then came the first injury. A young man traveling between farms was struck across the face by a bird that descended without warning. The wounds were shallow but precise. The bird disengaged immediately, rising and circling until the man retreated. A doctor later testified that the cuts suggested restraint rather than frenzy. Not the work of a startled animal, he said, but of something trained to stop short. That testimony changed the tone of the record. An investigation was formally opened, though quietly. Whitcomb was not arrested. He was observed. Deputies noted the timing of bird activity, the paths taken, the apparent coordination. They found no direct command given in public view, no gesture that could be cited, only results. By July, the phrase appearing most often in margins and notes was the same: intent without instruction. And in a state already unsettled by divided authority and invisible lines of allegiance, the idea that something could be guided without visible command unsettled people far more than violence ever had. As the inquiry deepened, attention shifted from the incidents themselves to their timing. County clerks began comparing dates, noting that reports clustered around certain hours, early morning and late afternoon, when Whitcomb was known to train his birds. The pattern was not precise enough to prove coordination, but it was consistent enough to unsettle those compiling the notes. A deputy assigned to discreet surveillance recorded that Whitcomb often stood at the edge of his property during these periods, facing the fields rather than the woods. He did not gesture broadly. He did not call out. The deputy wrote that Whitcomb's posture appeared expectant, as though waiting for a response rather than issuing an order. No violation could be cited. Midway through July, a traveling minister submitted an affidavit after witnessing a peculiar scene. He described a bird descending toward him on a narrow path, stopping short, then rising again when he turned back. The minister stated, "I felt instructed without hearing instruction." He did not accuse Whitcomb by name, but the location left little doubt. Officials revisited the broader context of the time. Kentucky's precarious position during the Civil War had fostered a climate of suspicion and restraint, where overt acts were often avoided in favor of signals and intermediaries. This atmosphere, documented widely in accounts of Kentucky's divided wartime role, made it difficult to separate coincidence from intent. The Falconers' case seemed to mirror the era's ambiguity. A second constable inspection of Whitcomb's property yielded nothing actionable. The birds were healthy. Training logs, though sparse, described recall drills and controlled flight patterns. One entry referenced boundary work, a phrase the constable underlined without comment. When asked to explain, Whitcomb said it referred to keeping birds within known limits. No further clarification was offered. Rumors, meanwhile, evolved. Some claimed Whitcomb had trained birds to recognize certain colors or scents. Others insisted he used whistles too faint for most to hear. A few suggested the birds were responding to landmarks rather than commands. None of these claims could be substantiated, and all were treated as speculation. The investigation reached a tense pause when a child went missing briefly near the ridge. The child was found unharmed an hour later, having wandered into a thicket and become disoriented. No birds were seen during the search. Still, the proximity reignited fear. County notes from that day show a sharp change in language, potential escalation, public concern, preventative measures considered. Whitcomb was summoned for further questioning. He reiterated his denials, adding that trained animals often reflected their handlers' discipline, not their intent. "A bird flies where it is allowed," he said, according to the transcript. "It does not decide why." The statement lingered in the record, ambiguous and difficult to refute. By late July, the inquiry had produced no charges, only accumulation. Incidents without proof. Patterns without command. A man whose birds obeyed limits that no one else could see. And as summer wore on, the sense grew that whatever was happening did not require spectacle to be effective. It required only space, patience, and an understanding of how attention could be guided without being seized. By August, the investigation had begun to strain under its own weight. The accumulation of testimony pointed toward coordination, yet nothing met the threshold of intent required for arrest. County officials found themselves trapped between public anxiety and the absence of a chargeable act. In a different year, the matter might have been dismissed outright. In 1863 Kentucky, restraint felt riskier than action. A circuit judge was consulted informally. His notes, preserved later among unrelated papers, reveal his hesitation. He wrote that animals could not be summoned to testify, and men could not be charged for what they did not visibly do. He warned that pursuing the matter without proof might inflame tensions already heightened by the war. The advice was to observe, not confront. Observation continued. A pair of deputies stationed themselves along the ridge trail for several days. Their logs describe birds appearing only when travelers crossed certain points, never before, never after. One deputy remarked that the birds behaved like sentries rather than predators. They did not chase. They did not strike unless the boundary was crossed again. The word boundary appears repeatedly in the margins. A neighbor of Whitcomb's, an elderly woman whose property bordered the woods, submitted a brief statement. She claimed that the birds roosted silently at night and returned to Whitcomb's land by dawn without prompting. "They know where to be," she said, like they were told once and remembered. Attention returned to Whitcomb's past. County travel records confirmed he had spent time outside Kentucky before the war, including a period in eastern states where falconry clubs were more common. No evidence suggested criminal training, yet one letter surfaced, written years earlier, in which Whitcomb described falconry as the art of influence without force. The phrase was copied into the case notes. Midway through August, a final incident shifted the tone again. A group of men traveling together ignored warnings and attempted to cross the ridge at dusk. Birds appeared almost immediately, circling low. When one man stepped forward, a bird struck his shoulder, then withdrew. The group retreated together. No further pursuit occurred. The consistency was undeniable. The birds did not escalate. They enforced. Public discussion grew quieter after that. People stopped debating whether Whitcomb was guilty and began adjusting behavior instead. Paths changed. Work schedules shifted. Children were kept away from the ridge without explanation. Whitcomb himself became more withdrawn. Deputies noted he reduced public training sessions, keeping birds hooded more often. When asked why, he replied only that attention disrupted discipline. No threats were made. No warnings issued. By the end of the month, the investigation had reached an unspoken conclusion. No crime could be proven. No danger could be denied. The file remained open but inactive. What lingered instead was a shared understanding. Someone had found a way to shape movement without confrontation, to direct without command, to allow choice while removing options. And in a state already accustomed to invisible lines and unspoken loyalties, that realization felt more unsettling than any accusation ever could. As summer waned, the case drifted into a quieter phase, not resolved but contained. County records show fewer formal complaints, though private correspondence suggests the incidents did not stop. People simply stopped reporting them. The birds continued to appear. The paths continued to change. A ledger kept by a general store near the ridge includes a curious note dated early September. It records a drop in foot traffic from one direction, accompanied by the clerk's remark, "They've all gone the long way now." No explanation follows. The entry stands alone, unremarked upon in later pages. Whitcomb's land became something like a fixed point around which movement adjusted. Travelers avoided passing too close. Deliveries were rerouted. Even patrols shortened their circuits without instruction. None of this was ordered. It emerged gradually, as though the community had learned a lesson without being taught. A county doctor was asked to review injury reports connected to the incidents. His assessment noted a lack of severity and an unusual consistency. The wounds, he wrote, were corrective rather than destructive. He added that the birds disengaged precisely when compliance occurred. The phrasing was clinical, but the implication was not lost on those who read it. Midway through September, a fire destroyed a small outbuilding on Whitcomb's property. No one was injured. The cause was listed as accidental, yet neighbors remarked that the birds did not scatter during the blaze. They remained perched nearby, hooded and silent until the fire was extinguished. The observation was recorded once, then never again. Attention briefly turned to the possibility of relocation. Officials considered encouraging Whitcomb to move, framing it as a preventative measure. The idea was abandoned quietly. No statute supported it. And privately, some admitted uncertainty about whether relocation would change anything at all. A casual callback to Kentucky's wartime instability appeared again in internal notes, suggesting that the case reflected broader patterns of indirect control common during the Civil War period. Influence was exercised through proxies, boundaries enforced without confrontation. Whitcomb's birds, whether intentionally or not, seemed to embody that same logic. By early autumn, the investigation existed only on paper. No new interviews were conducted, no surveillance maintained. The file thickened without advancing. Whitcomb was last seen that season walking the ridge at dusk, birds circling high and wide above him. A witness later said the scene looked rehearsed, though no one could say by whom. And as leaves fell and paths closed naturally with the coming cold, the question that remained was no longer whether the birds had been trained to turn on people. It was whether anyone would ever be able to prove that turning back had not been the intended outcome all along. By October, the ridge had taken on a new character. It was not marked, fenced, or patrolled, yet it had become functionally closed. County maps still showed it as passable, but usage had dropped to almost nothing. People behaved as though an agreement had been reached, though no meeting had ever been held. Whitcomb's name appeared less frequently in official writing after that. When it did, it was in neutral terms: property records, feed purchases, routine matters. The investigation had not been closed, but it had lost momentum. There was no precipitating event to force a conclusion. The matter had simply settled. A deputy who had followed the case closely later wrote a private letter to his brother, reflecting on the difficulty of pursuing wrongdoing without violation. He noted that the birds never exceeded what might be called restraint. They corrected, they warned, they withdrew. In another context, he wrote, such behavior would be praised as discipline. The birds themselves became more elusive. Witnesses reported fewer sightings but greater effect. A single shadow overhead was often enough to redirect a traveler. No contact was required. The presence alone seemed sufficient. Whitcomb was questioned once more before winter, this time by a different official. The exchange was brief. When asked whether he believed animals could understand limits placed upon people, Whitcomb replied that all creatures understood boundaries when those boundaries were consistent. The answer was recorded without comment. As colder weather approached, The ridge fell quiet. Snow covered paths. Movement slowed everywhere, not just near Whitcomb's land. The birds were kept hooded for longer periods, brought out less frequently. Training sessions ceased in public view. The case, such as it was, entered dormancy with the season. And yet, among those who lived nearby, something had changed permanently. The idea that space itself could be governed, without force, without decree, had taken root. People no longer asked who controlled the ridge. They acted as though the answer no longer mattered. In the silence of early winter, with Kentucky's divided war pressing elsewhere, the falconer and his birds faded from attention. What remained was the boundary, unmarked, unspoken, and obeyed. Winter deepened, and with it came a lull that many mistook for resolution. Snow softened the ridge and erased what little trace of altered movement there had been. The birds remained mostly unseen, kept close, their presence reduced to memory rather than encounter. Official attention shifted elsewhere, drawn by more urgent matters tied to the war. Yet the boundary did not dissolve with the season. A trapper traveling through the area late in December submitted a short statement after turning back near the ridge. He reported no birds, no sound, no visible obstruction, only a strong reluctance to proceed, which he attributed to instinct rather than fear. "Didn't feel right to keep going," he wrote. The phrase echoed earlier testimony, though no one noted the similarity at the time. Whitcomb was seen less frequently in town. When he did appear, he spoke little and lingered less. Merchants recalled that he purchased feed and equipment in exact quantities, never more, never less. His precision had always been remarked upon. Now it felt deliberate in a different way. A casual mention of Kentucky's wartime climate appeared again in a local circular, describing how communities adapted through unspoken agreements when formal authority was stretched thin. The description matched what had unfolded near the ridge: order maintained without instruction, compliance achieved without confrontation. By early 1864, the case file had begun to yellow. No new affidavits were added, no further injuries reported. The absence of escalation was taken as success, though no one could say what had been prevented. Spring would eventually come. Paths would reopen. The ridge would reveal itself again. And when it did, those who lived nearby already knew how to behave. They had learned where not to go, without ever being told why. When spring returned in 1864, it did not bring clarity. The thaw revealed familiar ground, paths re-emerging, brush settling back into place. But the habits formed the previous year remained intact. Travelers resumed their routes cautiously, yet few tested the ridge. The boundary, once enforced by birds, now seemed upheld by memory. A county surveyor passing near Whitcomb's land noted an odd absence of wildlife in the immediate area. Deer tracks diverted away from the ridge. Smaller birds avoided the trees closest to the mews. The observation was logged as seasonal variation, though the surveyor privately remarked that the land felt kept, as if claimed without markers. Whitcomb resumed limited training sessions, but only within his own fields. Witnesses reported the birds flying precise arcs, never drifting beyond a certain distance. Their recall was immediate, their discipline unquestionable. To an outside observer, it was exemplary falconry. To those familiar with the previous summer, it looked like maintenance rather than practice. Midway through the spring, a letter surfaced from a neighboring county describing a similar pattern: hawks behaving with unusual restraint near a rural road, redirecting foot traffic without harm. The letter mentioned no names. It ended with the line, "Perhaps birds remember more than we expect." The document was filed and forgotten. A casual callback to Kentucky's wartime divisions appeared again in regional correspondence, suggesting that indirect control had become a survival skill during the conflict. Communities learned to shape behavior quietly, avoiding overt force. Whitcomb's Ridge was cited indirectly as an example of how influence could persist without presence. No new accusations were raised. No charges filed. The Falconer's name faded from conversation, replaced by the ridge itself. People spoke of it as one speaks of a river after flood season, something to be respected, not tested. By late spring, it was clear that the birds were no longer needed. The boundary held without them. And in that realization lay the most unsettling detail of all. Whatever lesson had been taught no longer required a teacher. By the summer of 1864, the ridge had become a quiet fixture of local understanding. It was not avoided out of fear, nor respected as sacred ground. It was simply treated as complete. People planned around it the way one plans around a closed bridge long after the water has receded. Whitcomb's property appeared unchanged. Tax rolls show no irregularities, no fines, no orders to relocate. His birds remained registered as livestock, their care documented in sparse but orderly logs. Officially, nothing about his situation required action, yet journals from nearby farms tell a different story. One entry describes a hired hand who attempted to cross the ridge out of impatience, only to turn back within minutes, shaken but unharmed. He could not explain why. "Felt watched," he wrote, then crossed the words out and replaced them with "felt directed." That phrasing appeared nowhere else in the record, but the sentiment surfaced often enough to be understood. A local magistrate, reviewing unresolved matters from the previous year, noted the Falconer's case in passing. He wrote that it represented a failure of law not because it went unpunished, but because it never escalated. There was nothing to respond to, no act that demanded correction. A brief reference to Kentucky's wartime experience appeared again in correspondence between county officials, noting how communities had adapted to ambiguity during the conflict. Authority, the letter suggested, often functioned best when it remained unseen. The comparison was not lost on those familiar with the ridge. By late summer, Whitcomb's birds were seen less often in flight. When they did appear, they moved quickly and with purpose, as though completing tasks already agreed upon. No incidents followed. No complaints were filed. Children growing up near the ridge learned its limits without instruction. They did not play there. They did not ask why. The absence of explanation made the boundary more durable, not less. As the war dragged on and attention shifted elsewhere, the Falconer's name receded further into the background. The birds no longer needed to demonstrate anything. The space they had shaped remained obedient. And so the story did not end with arrest or revelation, but with habit. A line drawn once, held quietly and never challenged again. By the autumn of 1864, the ridge had ceased to function as a location of interest and had become something closer to an accepted limit. Travelers no longer spoke of avoiding it. They simply did. Routes shifted subtly on maps drawn by hand, bends added where none had existed before. These changes were never formalized, yet they persisted. Whitcomb himself appeared increasingly peripheral to the matter. A store ledger from October lists his purchases without remark, though the clerk later recalled that Whitcomb asked fewer questions than before, as if certain outcomes were already settled. When asked once about the birds, he replied only that training was most successful when it no longer needed repetition. A county constable conducting routine rounds near the ridge recorded a moment of hesitation in his log. He wrote that he felt compelled to dismount and wait before proceeding, though no obstacle presented itself. After several minutes, the sensation passed, and he continued without incident. The entry ends with a single line, "No cause observed." Midway through the season, a small group of soldiers passed through the area en route to another county. Unfamiliar with local custom, they approached the ridge directly. According to later testimony, their progress slowed without instruction. One soldier claimed he felt as though he had missed a step that wasn't there. The group detoured shortly afterward, attributing the decision to time constraints. A casual callback to Kentucky's position during the Civil War appeared again in an internal report, noting that the state's fractured authority had given rise to unconventional forms of order. The report did not mention Whitcomb, but the parallel was evident: influence exercised without visible command. As winter approached, the birds were kept almost entirely out of sight. The ridge lay quiet beneath early frost. No incidents occurred. No reminders were necessary. By the year's end, the case file remained technically open, though no one expected it to change. The Falcon master had not been proven guilty of anything. The birds had not been shown to act beyond training. And yet the effect remained undeniable. The boundary held, not because it was enforced, but because it had been accepted. And in that acceptance, the question of intent became less important than outcome. By early 1865, the ridge had outlasted the controversy that created it. The war's final months shifted attention decisively elsewhere, and whatever scrutiny had once hovered over Whitcomb dissolved into administrative fatigue. The falconer's name appeared only in routine documents now: feed purchases, land assessments, census preparations. A schoolmaster compiling local histories that winter included a brief reference to the altered routes near the ridge. He did not name Whitcomb, only noting that custom has replaced instruction. The line suggests a settled condition rather than an ongoing dispute. Whitcomb's birds were reported to be fewer in number. Some had been released, others transferred or lost to age. Yet those that remained behaved as they always had: responsive, contained, precise. A visitor to the property remarked that they seemed almost bored, as if their most important work had already been completed. A casual mention of Kentucky's wartime experience surfaced again in a regional essay, discussing how communities adapted when formal authority weakened. The author wrote that indirect control often proved more durable than force, because it asked less resistance. Readers unfamiliar with the ridge passed over the idea. Those who lived nearby understood it immediately. One final affidavit was added to the case file in March. It came from a traveler who had approached the ridge unknowingly and turned back after experiencing what he called a strong sense of conclusion. He could not explain the phrase, neither could the clerk who recorded it. The affidavit was accepted and filed without comment. Whitcomb was never charged. He was never exonerated. The ambiguity suited everyone involved. No confrontation was required. No precedent set. As spring approached, the ridge remained exactly as it had been, unmarked, open, and unused. People crossed elsewhere without complaint. The birds were rarely seen. The falconer kept to his land. And with the war's end drawing near, the case faded fully into background knowledge, something remembered only when needed and otherwise left alone. The boundary had done its work. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. When the war finally ended in the spring of 1865, Kentucky exhaled slowly. Roads reopened. Movement increased. Soldiers returned home carrying habits formed elsewhere. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the quiet understandings developed during the conflict might dissolve under renewed normalcy. They did not. Newcomers to the area learned quickly which routes were favored and which were not. The ridge near Whitcomb's land remained absent from conversation, mentioned only when someone asked directly, and even then answers were vague. No reason to go that way was often enough. A county assessor visiting that summer remarked on the unusual stability of property lines near the ridge. Boundaries had not shifted in years. Disputes were rare. He noted the fact in passing, then moved on. In another context, such stability would have been praised. Whitcomb appeared briefly in town during the summer months, thinner now, quieter. He was described as courteous but distant, as though his attention lay elsewhere. When asked about his birds, he replied that some lessons did not require repetition. The statement was recorded second-hand and never verified. A casual callback to the state's wartime experience appeared again in a county circular, noting that habits formed under pressure often persisted longer than laws. The comment was intended generally, but it echoed the ridge's quiet authority. By late summer, even curiosity had faded. No one attempted to test the boundary. Children raised during the war accepted it as natural. Those who remembered its creation no longer felt the need to explain it. The birds themselves were scarcely seen now. Their absence did not weaken the effect. If anything, it confirmed that whatever had been established no longer depended on enforcement. The ridge stood unchanged. Open ground, ordinary trees, no sign of danger. And yet, it remained unused, like a door everyone agreed not to open. By the late summer of 1865, the ridge had fully transitioned from incident to inheritance. It belonged now not to memory, but to routine. People adjusted their movements without recalling when the adjustment began. The boundary had outlived its origin. A traveling cartographer passing through the county made a quiet notation on his draft map, sketching a longer route where the ridge path once ran straight. When asked later why he altered it, he replied that local guidance suggested the original route was no longer in use. He did not inquire further. The map was published with the change intact. Whitcomb's property showed signs of gradual decline. Census notes indicate fewer birds, fewer supplies, and reduced output. Yet there was no suggestion of hardship. Those who observed him described a man who appeared satisfied with closure rather than progress. He no longer trained in public view. What little work he did seemed repetitive, almost ceremonial. A journal kept by a neighboring farmer records a moment of reflection that autumn. He wrote that the ridge no longer felt guarded, only finished. The distinction mattered to him. Guarded implied vigilance. Finished implied completion. He crossed out the first word and left the second. References to Kentucky's Civil War years continued to surface in later testimony, often emphasizing how people learned to live alongside unresolved authority. The Falconers case fit neatly into that pattern, a problem addressed without being solved, contained without being confronted. No new incidents occurred. No birds intervened. No warnings were issued. The absence of activity confirmed what many already suspected. The lesson had been absorbed. Whitcomb himself faded from record. The last confirmed entry bearing his name appears in a land assessment late that year. After that, references cease. Whether he moved, died, or simply withdrew from notice remains unclear. The ridge remained, and in its continued emptiness it carried forward the quietest legacy of all, not fear, not obedience, but acceptance. By early 1866, the ridge had become something like an agreed omission. It appeared on older maps and in fading records, yet it no longer figured into planning, conversation, or concern. The community behaved as though the land itself had rendered a decision, and that decision required no explanation. A county clerk reviewing archived complaints from the war years noted the Falconers' file and added a brief summary for consolidation. The summary was concise to the point of discomfort. No charges, no recurrence, area avoided. The clerk did not expand on the reasoning, perhaps because there was none that fit cleanly into language. Whitcomb's property passed through the seasons quietly. Neighbors observed that the mews were still maintained, though fewer birds were kept. When asked about the change, one neighbor said Whitcomb had mentioned that training was most effective when it was no longer visible. The remark was repeated, then forgotten. A casual callback to Kentucky's recent history appeared again in a regional address discussing post-war normalization. The speaker noted that habits formed under pressure often endured long after their causes had disappeared. He spoke generally. Those who knew the ridge heard specificity. Late that spring, a group of surveyors briefly considered reopening the old route to shorten travel between counties. The proposal stalled without formal objection. One member of the group later said it simply felt unnecessary. There were other ways through, better ways even if they were longer. The birds were rarely seen now. When they did appear, it was high above, distant, indistinct. Their presence no longer prompted reaction. The boundary held without demonstration. In private, some admitted relief. The absence of spectacle meant the absence of escalation. Nothing had been proven. Nothing had been denied. The land had been allowed to settle into its own arrangement. And so, without ceremony, the case slipped further from relevance. It did not end. It concluded itself. The ridge remained open and unused, a lesson completed and therefore no longer taught. By mid-1866, the Falconers' case had ceased to function as a narrative at all. It survived only as an absence in the county's habits, an understanding embedded so deeply that few remembered learning it. The ridge was not feared nor discussed. It simply did not belong to movement anymore. A local historian compiling post-war recollections included a brief, indirect reference. He wrote that certain areas lost their usefulness without losing their form, and that communities adapted not by decree, but by shared restraint. The ridge fit the description precisely, though it was never named. Whitcomb himself became increasingly difficult to place. Some claimed he still lived on the land, tending what few birds remained. Others said the property stood empty for long stretches. Tax records continued to list his name, but no personal sightings were confirmed. The uncertainty drew no concern. His presence, like the boundary, no longer required verification. A farmer whose land bordered the ridge noted that even livestock avoided the area without prompting. Cattle grazed up to a certain line and no further. Fences had not changed. Nothing visible enforced the limit. The behavior was recorded once in a farm ledger, then accepted as routine. A passing mention of Kentucky's Civil War aftermath appeared again in a regional report, observing that indirect systems of order often outlasted formal ones. The observation was framed as sociological, not historical, yet it captured the ridge's quiet authority more accurately than any affidavit ever had. By late summer, the last tangible reminder of the case faded. The county clerk who had once underlined witness statements retired. His replacement inherited the files without context. The Falconer's folder was moved to storage, labeled only by year and location. No summary was added, no conclusion drawn. The birds, if they remained at all, no longer made themselves known. Their absence did not weaken the boundary. It confirmed that whatever had been established no longer depended on reinforcement. And so the ridge endured, not as a place of threat or mystery, but as a completed act. A space shaped once, then left to persist on its own terms. By the close of 1866, the ridge had settled into the background of daily life so completely that it was no longer recognized as unusual. It existed the way certain silences exist, noticed only when broken. No one attempted to cross it. No one spoke of enforcing it. The absence of effort became its own proof of success. A post-war land review conducted that winter described the area in neutral terms. Soil quality was average. Timber was usable. There was no natural reason for disuse. The report moved on without comment, as though usefulness were determined by more than material conditions. Whitcomb's name appeared once more in a legal notice concerning unpaid taxes, then disappeared again. Whether the notice was resolved, ignored, or rendered irrelevant by circumstance is unclear. No follow-up record exists. The lack of concern suggests that his presence or absence had ceased to matter. An elderly resident later recalled that the birds were never spoken of again after that year, not because they were forgotten, but because they were no longer necessary. They did their work, she said. After that, people remembered for them. Her statement was recorded decades later, when memory had already softened details into impressions. A casual callback to Kentucky's Reconstruction period appeared again in a local address, noting that some wartime adjustments lingered not out of fear but efficiency. Communities kept what worked. The ridge, inconvenient as it was, worked. Travelers passing through the county learned its patterns quickly. They followed longer routes without complaint. When asked why, locals answered vaguely or not at all. The lack of explanation discouraged further inquiry. By then, even the idea of accusation had faded. The Falcon Master was no longer accused of anything. His role had shifted from suspect to origin, and then from origin to irrelevance. What remained was the outcome. The ridge stayed open, empty, and quietly obeyed, not because birds circled overhead, not because anyone watched, but because once a boundary is learned without force, it rarely needs to be enforced again. By 1867, the ridge had become something closer to an inherited rule than a remembered event. New families moved into the area, unfamiliar with Whitcomb, unaware of the birds, yet they learned the limits as quickly as anyone else. They followed paths already worn into habit. No one needed to explain why those paths curved away when a straighter route existed. A county schoolhouse lesson from that year, preserved in a handwritten notebook, listed local geography for children to memorize. The ridge was included by name, but no trail was marked across it. The omission went unremarked. The children learned the land as it was lived, not as it once had been. Whitcomb's property finally changed hands that year. Deeds show a quiet transfer, no dispute, no announcement. The new owner made no use of the mews. The structures stood empty, then slowly collapsed with weather. No birds were found when the land was surveyed. Whether they had been released or taken elsewhere was never recorded. A casual reference to Kentucky's wartime years appeared one last time in a county address, noting that some controls introduced during instability became permanent simply because they proved effective. The speaker offered no examples. None were needed. Those who remembered Whitcomb spoke of him rarely now, and when they did, it was without accusation or defense. He was recalled as precise, patient, and deeply attentive to limits. Whether he had intended the outcome attributed to him mattered less than the fact that it endured. By late autumn, the ridge was indistinguishable from any other stretch of land, trees, stone, open sky. Nothing about it suggested restriction. And yet no one crossed there. The boundary had detached completely from its maker. It existed on its own. By the time the record closes, sometime in the late 1860s, there is no formal ending to the case of the Falcon Master, only an absence where conclusions are usually placed. The county files do not declare innocence or guilt. They simply stop asking questions. The ridge remains open on paper and closed in practice, a contradiction no one feels compelled to resolve. Later reflections on Kentucky's Civil War years would describe the state as a place shaped as much by restraint as by action, where divided loyalties encouraged subtlety over force, and influence often moved ahead of law. In that light, the events near the ridge appear less like an anomaly and more like an extreme expression of the era's habits. Control exercised quietly, compliance achieved without command, order maintained without spectacle. The falconer's name fades completely after the transfer of his land. No obituary appears. No relocation is recorded. He becomes, like the boundary itself, an origin without a visible endpoint. Those who knew him best offer no final testimony. They remember him as careful, exacting, and uninterested in excess. Whether that description explains anything is left to the listener. The birds never return to public view. Their absence does not invite investigation. It confirms what had already been learned. That enforcement was no longer required. The lesson had moved from action into memory, and from memory into habit. Decades later, when professors and local historians reviewed Kentucky's post-war adjustments, a few noted places where use had changed without cause, paths abandoned, routes redirected, spaces left intentionally empty. The ridge was one such place. It drew no footnotes. It did not need them. And so the story remains unfinished in the only way that matters. There is no final incident, no exposure, no confession recovered from a trunk or journal. There is only a landscape that absorbed a decision and kept it. If you were to walk there now, along that quiet ridge in Kentucky, you would find nothing to warn you away. No markers, no fences, no circling birds. Only the long memory of a place that once learned how to be obeyed without ever having to ask. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling legacy of all.